Hey, it's Natalie, and welcome back to Primary Focus. I am so excited for my interview today with Ryan Wexelblatt, founder of ADHD Dude. Part YouTube channel and part membership community, Ryan guides families that have children with ADHD to help their children succeed in school and in life. Well, hi, Ryan. Thank you for coming on today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Do you want to start just by introducing yourself, give us a little bit of your background, your mission, why you're so passionate about ADHD?
Yeah. So my name's Ryan Wexelblatt. I have a YouTube channel called ADHD Dude. I am a former school social worker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, father to a son with ADHD, and now I work with families of kids with ADHD, and that's pretty much all I do. And I also have a summer camp for kids with ADHD.
Oh, wow. Summer camp sounds like so much fun. I wanted to have you on today because as a former teacher, I get reached out to a lot about ADHD and parents that maybe their child was just diagnosed. They want to know the teacher's approach, or they're wondering if their child needs a diagnosis of ADHD. And for me, I've always felt like I'm in this funny little dance where I can't answer the question. I know what it is. I've worked with students that have ADHD. I've received accommodations and come up with my own techniques to help them. But at the same time, I was never allowed to answer the question or, of course, not diagnose, but even suggest it too heavily. And so it always felt a little odd because I'm working in this space. I need to be ready to help these students, but I can't talk about it. I've definitely had cases where a parent maybe needed the nudge to start thinking in that direction and have had to kind of softly nudge them and say, hey, have you talked to a doctor about some of these things? And I've been met with like defensiveness and very upset reactions by that. And I've met reactions from parents that went and got an answer from their doctor and started exploring what's going on. But even now that I'm out of the classroom, I still get asked all the time. So I wanted to bring you on here just to be a great resource. Can you briefly share what ADHD is and what is your approach?
ADHD is technically what we would call a neurodevelopmental disorder. I don't like the word disorder really, so I call it a neurodevelopmental difference. So it's just a difference in the way the brain works. I explain ADHD as an executive function developmental delay, meaning the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that controls executive functioning, and there's some other aspects of the brain that cover executive functioning, is approximately 2 to 3 years behind kids similar age peers. So people often think of ADHD as difficulty sustaining attention or hyperactivity. And it actually is much more than that. Really at its core, what ADHD is difficulty sustaining attention to things that are not interesting to you. But it's also this global delay in these executive function skills that we can speak about. So my thing is that I want to educate parents about ADHD because I have a saying that for most families, they are unintentionally misled as soon as their child is diagnosed with ADHD.
Mm.
Both because people, educators, people in the medical field, mental health field. Number one, they're just not familiar with what the evidence-based treatment recommendations are. But a lot of families are just not really given helpful information, from the very beginning. Most are just told your child has ADHD. Do you want to consider medication? Go find a therapist. And ironically, therapy is not even a recommended treatment for kids with ADHD. So that's really my goal, and my mission is to educate families and to use evidence informed information and factual information. So we're looking at this from a perspective of science and what the research data tells us, not just kind of opinions. And obviously I have a lot of experience as a former school social worker and as a father, but at the end of the day, I want this to come from a place of evidence and data for families.
Boy, there are a lot of opinions on ADHD out there. So I love to hear that you are trying to take a scientific approach there and keeping up with the latest research. And I just want to touch on this too. I've heard the term ADD is outdated, ADHD is the new term. Can you touch on that?
I don't remember the year, but the term ADD stopped being used. I think it was in the 90s or 80s. I don't remember, but it was over 30 years. What used to be called ADD is now called ADHD inattentive type. So there's really kind of three different presentations of ADHD. There's the inattentive type. There's what's called the hyperactive impulsive type, and there's the combined type, which combines the inattentiveness and the hyperactivity and impulsivity. I have never once in my career seen a child who just presents with the hyperactivity part, yet can sustain attention to things that are not interesting to them. So I really say there's two presentations of ADHD. Either you have the hyperactivity and impulsivity piece, or you don't.
Thank you for kind of clarifying that there. If you suspect your child has ADHD, what should you do and what shouldn't you do?
The way an accurate ADHD diagnosis is made is through collecting data from people who see the child in natural environments. So, parents, teachers, other caregivers, if they go to daycare, people tend to go way overboard in seeking an ADHD diagnosis. So, if we have concerns about, learning issues or, possibly a comorbid condition like depression or anxiety, then, a psychological evaluation would be appropriate. But if we're not concerned about that, then really a diagnosis can be made through a pediatrician. And the way you do that is you get, ratings forms to fill out. And I always suggest to parents, rather than just you and the teachers filling them out, give them to, other people who spends time with your child. Because again, the more we can collect information from people who see the child in their different natural environments, the more of an accurate diagnosis that we're going to make. The one thing I really suggest to parents is to stay out of Facebook ADHD parent groups and out of any, neurodiverse, parent Facebook groups, because they are just full of misinformation and disinformation and a helpful comment here or there. But for the most part, they're completely full of misinformation and oftentimes a lot of dangerous information as well.
Yeah, that's scary. I think you can really get down a wormhole when you start looking up things online for yourself.
I want people to make decisions on treatment based on evidence, not their emotions, not opinions.
When I hear about ADHD and talk to families about it, sometimes I've said ADHD is like a superpower and that kids need to understand their diagnosis so they can understand how to use their power. What do you think about that?
One of the things that I teach, have always taught kids in my school year programs and my summer camp is that, a lot of people with ADHD become very successful because when they learn to, harness their ability to hyper focus on things that are interesting, that's something that can really serve them well in life. And there's, other ways that ADHD can serve you well in life. What I do encourage is I encourage parents not to talk about ADHD as a gift or a superpower. And the reason why is because, let's face it that, you don't have to take medicine for something that's, a gift, you know. And the other part is, I don't think that ADHD is taken seriously in our culture. I don't think the mental health field takes it seriously. I certainly don't think the education field takes it seriously. And what I explain to parents is if we want ADHD to be taken seriously, we can't advocate for it to be taken seriously. At the same time, call it a superpower because that contradicts each other.
I think you've got a really great point there. And we want it to be taken seriously. The effort families have to go through to even get a diagnosis. We want to treat it with the respect that it deserves and ensure that children continue to get treatment and the support that they need. You touched on medicine there. If a child has
Mhm.
ADHD, is medicine the only option? Do you think children need to have medicine?
So personally, I follow the American Academy of Pediatrics ADHD treatment recommendations because number one, they're evidence based, and number two, because I do find that they produce the best results for families in the most time and cost effective way possible. So the AAP treatment recommendations for children under 6 are parent training first. That's what I provide through my membership site, followed by the use of methylphenidate if necessary. For children 6 and up, it's parent training in conjunction with medication management. So here's my thing. I don't tell parents what they should or shouldn't do with medication, but what I do ask them is please make an educated decision about medication because the long-term research data shows that for people with ADHD who go unmedicated, there's a lot more negative outcomes for them in life because we do have long-term research data on this. The most concerning one is that having ADHD and going unmedicated doubles your chances of developing a substance abuse problem in adolescence. So, that's always something I want people to know. So again, I say to parents, make medication decisions, through a discussion with your physician. Hopefully they're educated about ADHD. Not all of them are, and again, we want to go by data and evidence and not fears, not opinions, and not emotions.
It's a very difficult process, I hear, for families figuring out the medication. Do you find a lot of children end up switching different types of medication or different doses before they find what's working for them?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, this is really a matter of trial and error, and you just have to be patient with it. I mean, I've seen it take 8 months to find the right one. The beautiful thing though about stimulants is that if your child doesn't have a good reaction to one, it's out of your system the same day. So the other thing I always want people to know is that stimulants are the most researched medications in the history of the psychiatry field, and they are also considered amongst the safest.
I think that's really important to know. Half the battle of medication is if you're going to put your child on something every day for an extended period of time, you want to know
Mhm.
that it's not going to be building up in their system. So, what are some resources
Right.
you'd recommend for
Right.
families?
Yeah. So, well, obviously, my YouTube channel I think is a great resource. I suggest, Attitude Magazine, who I create content for as well. And Chad, that's children and adults with ADHD. So those are, really kind of the two primary resources. And, if they want to find information about medication, I always suggest, going to, credible websites like, a WebMD or, Mayo Clinic, those types of websites.
Absolutely. So I have a couple questions from subscribers here. The first is my 7-year-old daughter, who's in second grade, was recently diagnosed with ADHD. I feel very overwhelmed with how to talk to her about this. I don't want her to think something is wrong with her. Do you think you can speak to that?
Mhm. Well, I think, you have to think for a 7-year old, because we describe to them, that this is a description of how your brain works. That doesn't mean they're going to think anything is wrong with them. So if you don't imply that anything's wrong with them, they're not going to think anything is wrong with them. And that's how I explain ADHD to kids. I say it's just a description of how your brain works. And it means, your brain is going to make some things a little easier for you. And it might make some things a little more challenging for you. And then I explain, for me, my brain makes, being coordinated at sports challenging for me, but it might make, making friends easy for me. Well, for somebody else, their brain might make sports really easy for them to learn. And it might make, something like, making friends a little more difficult to learn. And we all have things that, we need practice with and things that come naturally to us. And that's just part of ADHD.
When I was in the classroom, very often when I had parents come to me with different concerns, that was similar advice that I gave to parents too. Like, if the adults in the room are acting fine with it and have a plan and are, take the time to listen and understand, kids are going to follow the mood in the room and they're going to follow what the
Mhm.
adults around them are believing and saying. So if you're panicking and you're saying negative things and you seem very anxious and upset about a diagnosis, they're going to receive a message, whether you say it directly to them or not, or they're just sort of absorbing what you're giving out. They're going to get a negative
Mhm.
message from it. So, if we can kind of keep a positive tone, you can very intentionally
Mhm.
keep the mood positive.
Absolutely. I think the other thing is, and really right now in today's parenting climate, I think parents often think that their children are much more fragile than they are. And what I always say is kids are not fragile, kids are anti-fragile, and if we treat them as fragile, they're going to think they're fragile. So for
Mhm.
instance, when people withhold a diagnosis from a child because for that reason they worry, well, I don't want her to think anything is wrong with her. Well, if you don't tell your child about it, and if you don't explain it to them, then they have no context for understanding how their brain works. But what happens if they find out about it eventually? Well, then the message that you've unintentionally sent them is this is something to be ashamed of and should be hidden.
I know so many parents are worried about their child being labeled in school. I just always heard this like, my child's going to be labeled, my child's going to be labeled. But very often we were having serious conversations in the classroom because something was not right in the classroom. We've reached an
Mhm.
impasse here. And if the answer is, can you go to your pediatrician and get the form and let me and some other adults that spend
Mhm.
time with your child fill it out, we can at least change the conversation we're having now. I think some of the trope of labels, things have changed in education a lot. Like, it's not negative to be labeled anymore. It's actually helpful a lot of the time because you come with directions. It lets everybody know, okay, this is exactly what my kiddo needs. Or if you start to see behavior like
Mhm.
this is the answer. Let's fix it right now.
The other thing I say to that, in terms of, when people say, well, I don't want them to be labeled, I said, well, number one, that's an irrational fear you have, and they're not going to have ADHD tattooed across their forehead for the rest of their life. People tend to, yeah, have irrational fears about this just because they don't understand, understandably how the school system necessarily works, and that this is not some kind of death sentence.
Absolutely, and I think we have to remember too, if a child had physical needs, like
Mhm.
me needing sunscreen a lot of the time, I would hope that the adults taking
Mhm.
care of me could get me some darn sunscreen, and I think it's the same
Of
for
course.
internal things as well, like, it's we just don't always see it, and providing the language to be able to help each other is so, so, so important. Okay, well,
Exactly.
I've got another question from a subscriber here, working with an older child. My 10-year-old son, 5th grader, has ADHD. We have a good routine now, but I'm worried about the transition to middle school next year. Right now, he has 2 teachers during the day. Next year, he will have a different teacher for every subject. and have to walk in between classes. Do you have any advice
Mhm.
to prepare him for middle school?
So there's a few different things we can do. We can ideally before school starts help him understand what his schedule is. Ideally, go into school and help him understand, what is the path you take to get from this class to this class. See if we can find out, when the students have a chance to go to their locker between classes. So the more we can kind of, structure this for him in a way that feels routine and he understands, this is when I go to my locker, this is when I, have to go directly to this class. All those things are going to help. The other thing as well is that when kids get to middle school, we really want to focus on helping them, move from prompt dependence to what I call independence. So if you're constantly saying to him, put this in your backpack, so on and so on, well, that's not helpful because what happens is when kids are constantly prompted, that means the adults around them are acting as their executive functioning and they're not learning to use their own executive functioning. So there's strategies we can put in place. This is the kind of stuff I teach to help kids move from prompt dependence towards independence. You can also do things like help him do homework in an order for the way his brain works. When I teach is that we do homework from, what is most boring to you, or as I say to kids, hardest for your brain to get through to what is easiest. Because that actually saves you time, with doing homework. If he has a 504 plan or an IEP, obviously there can be accommodations in there that continue from elementary school. So there's a lot of things we can do to support kids transition to middle school and to high school.
I love that you gave some advice that they can start with now as well, just adjusting that homework routine and even things as simple as who's packing their backpack and who's preparing their lunch. Like, if you can make adjustments that they're in charge of a little bit more in their day-to-day life, it sounds like that
Mhm.
will go the extra mile as they prepare for middle school. Oh my gosh, when I changed for middle school, I was a hot mess, so, I think kids really do need
Right.
extra support to prepare.
Yeah. And look, what I always say is, in terms of what you said about like packing your bag and lunch, the more you allow your child to use their own executive functioning instead of you acting as their executive functioning, the more it's going to speed up the process of them catching up, with their peers.
Can you speak to a little bit about letting kids fail through this process too?
I think when we talk about letting kids fail, I think there's two ways to look at this. Number one is, do they have the supports in place they need to be successful? Okay. And if not, then we need to look at that. Now, I do want to explain that sometimes we can put in too much support, which also hinders executive function skill development and can also enable learned helplessness. A lot of kids with ADHD become really skilled at learned helplessness. So we want to have supports in place to help them be successful, but also to challenge them, a little bit. The other part of this is, some kids with ADHD have a propensity to be very inflexible because flexibility is an aspect of executive functioning. So when kids are inflexible and they're not receptive to help, the two things are we don't want to accommodate their inflexibility, meaning we don't want to work around their inflexibility because when inflexibility is accommodated, it gets worse. But the other thing I also teach parents is if your child has a propensity to be inflexible and they're not, willing to accept your help or somebody else's help, then they need to experience the natural consequence of failure because that's the only thing that's going to help them learn to be more flexible.
Yeah, I think, oh my gosh, failure is the hardest thing, but it's also one of the best gifts that we can give kids too. I'd much rather them be
Absolutely.
bumbling along at age 11 trying to figure things out than, be learning these lessons when they're starting their first
Mhm.
job. There's plenty for them to learn
Absolutely.
at that point too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of speaks to, there's so many kids who go through high school and no fault of their own. When I talk about, parents acting as executive functioning, I don't say that with any kind of blame. What I always say is I believe parents are doing the best they can at any given moment with the information and resources they have available to them. And as I mentioned, a lot of parents are never educated about ADHD. So, when we have kids who go through high school, and their parents are packing their bags and telling them what they have for homework and waking them up every morning. Well, suddenly when you leave high school and you have to manage your life independently, whether you're in college, or a job, community college, that doesn't work out too well. And unfortunately, every year I get phone calls from parents, sometime between typically, November and January saying, my child went away to college and now they're home. They couldn't, make it. And it's never because of academics. It's never been because of mental health. It's because they, number one, can't control their screen time, okay, because they've never learned how to manage on their own, or it's because their parents have been acting as their executive functioning their whole life, and suddenly they're forced to use their own executive functioning, and they don't have that level of skill yet.
That's a really tough transition after they've been through everything to move out to
Mhm.
come back home. For what it's worth, a lot of people don't make it through their first semester in college or have to
Mhm.
change gears after their first year, and that's a really important life lesson as well too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you wanna speak a little bit more about your membership?
So I provide parent training. I have a membership site, and basically what it is, there's different courses in there. So, as I mentioned, parent behavior training is the recommended treatment for kids with ADHD. So, there actually were no parent behavior training programs in existence specifically for families of kids with ADHD. So I decided to create my own, and that's called Scaffolding Better Behavior. There's one called Executive Function Crash Course to help parents learn how to build the foundational executive function skills that kids are going to need to be successful, and help move them towards independence. So I don't teach things that, you've probably seen before, like, hanging up lists and making checklists, or using kitchen timers. Because at the end of the day, those things, they don't really help you develop these foundational skills that are lagging. I have one called Socially Smarter, where I teach parents how to help build what I call social executive function skills, what people often refer to as social skills. There's one about learning how to create daily expectations because, a common theme I see in families of kids with ADHD is what I call high giving, low expectations, where, kids are given, expensive smartphones and video game subscriptions and all these things. And very often nothing is asked of them in return except for maybe academic performance. And what I can tell you is, in every family where I've heard about kids exhibiting, really immature behavior at home, but nowhere else, the reason why is this: it's because of this high giving, low expectations, because they don't feel useful at home and because they don't have any responsibility at home. And then there's one about, making that bedtimes a little easier because bedtime can be challenging for a lot of, kids with ADHD as well. And then I also do office hours a few times a month where, people can come and, we do troubleshooting around the strategies and I answer their questions live. So yeah, that's, it started off as supposed to be like a little side project and it became my full-time job. So yeah, that's primarily what I do.
The internet can be just such a wormhole, and there's so much misinformation or conflicting information out there. I love that you've created a safe area where people can come in and get direct help from you and take your course as well. That's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, what I explain to people is if you're looking for actionable strategies, this is it. If you're looking just for a support group, probably you can find that elsewhere. But I really focus on actionable things that people can start implementing immediately.
I feel like that speaks to the social worker in you as well, like, you wanna lift people up, give give people the skills. And
Yeah,
what
I
age
guess so.
range
I
does that
never thought about
serve?
it that way. Yeah.
What age range does your community serve?
Everywhere from like 5 up to 17. I would say it definitely skews younger. So it's a lot of elementary, middle school, probably about up to about 15. That's the majority of families who use it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, that's exactly, who my audience is as well. Where can people find that if they're interested?
ADHDdude.com, my website.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, is there anything else you wanna say? Do you feel like we covered, the important things?
And I think the last thing I just want to mention to people is this can be really overwhelming, And one of the things is, sometimes parents will say, "Am I too late?" Or I feel like, I'm failing him or her. And I always say it is never too late to help your child. Okay. And you are not failing anybody. You're not doing anything wrong, and if you weren't an attentive parent, you wouldn't be seeking information. So, you just prove that you're not failing them by because you're being proactive about this. So I just want people to always understand that.
I love that. You're absolutely right. Finding out information is a huge first step and absolutely
Mhm.
shows again and again that parents care.
Exactly. If people want to check out the YouTube channel, there's hours of free content there and it's organized into playlists. There's some for parents and there's, a few for kids as well. I think would be helpful to a lot of people if, they're just new to this journey or just looking to learn, a little more about ADHD.
Absolutely. And I'll put all the link in the description as well so people can find you more easily. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time today. I feel like I learned so much new information, and I hope people are leaving this interview feeling empowered and like they have next steps if they're just figuring this out. Awesome. Well, thank you for chatting with me today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
So, what do you think? Did you learn something new about ADHD? Is there something you're wondering about ADHD? Leave a comment below to tell us what's on your mind. Thanks for watching Primary Focus. My name's Natalie. I'll see you next time. Hey, hold on a second. If you love this interview, you should check out my interview about screen time with Ash Brandon.